Hello class and welcome back. So for today's lesson, we're really going to start transitioning toward the end of our chapter on the Cold War and exploring one of the most important parts of it, and that is the conflict in Vietnam. In this class, we're really just going to be overviewing the Vietnam War. In your future coursework in US History 2, you'll delve much more deeply into this topic. So the goal here really is to take away a basic understanding of what happens. There's a lot of information included in this lesson. I'm going to be moving very quickly, so feel free to pause this video so that you can get your notes or get clarification as needed. Please title your notes for today, The Vietnam War. So, in terms of understanding the road to the war in Vietnam, it's really vital to recognize the situation Vietnam was in before the actual war. So, in the early 1900s, after the age of imperialism, France largely dominated the region where Vietnam is located, in Southeast Asia. This was called French Indochina at the time, and it included countries such as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Okay? So, in this region, many of the residents began wanting freedom, just like you saw in some of the other places that we explored this year. Think of India as one example. So, among these people who were pushing for independence was a man who you see pictured over there to the right, Ho Chi Minh. He was a Vietnamese nationalist, somebody who wanted Vietnam basically to be its own country and to be free of being a colonial possession. So the French sentenced Ho to death for spreading anti-French rhetoric, for causing violence, upheaval, and during the World War II era, he's actually going to return from fleeing after Japan takes control of the region during their imperial push into Asia, and he's going to found an organization called the Viet Minh. So the term Viet Minh obviously takes its name from Vietnam, and then of course Ho Chi Minh. So this group is basically the combined forces of nationalists, those who want to break free of France, and also communists in the region who want to change their government. So in 1954, a really important battle takes place called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It's an absolute catastrophic disaster for the French and a massive victory for the Viet Minh, to the point where the French really have no choice but to leave the area completely. So just to show you where we are in time, again, we're really covering this topic thematically, so you'll see we're going to move through several US presidencies. In future coursework, you'll move through this over the course of several weeks, maybe even months, but right now we're in the administration of Dwight Eisenhower. So, President Eisenhower famously said in a 1954 news conference that if one country were allowed to fall to communism, it would basically create a ripple effect. He called it the domino theory. If one country were allowed to fall to communism, just like a domino, it would be pushed over, forcing the countries around it to also collapse. So this is really going to set the tone for a shift in US policy. Don't forget, under President Truman, the policy really was about containment, keeping communism contained to where it is and not really allowing it to spread any further. So, how is this really going to cause a massive shift in US policy? At the time, the Secretary of State, SOS's Secretary of State, was a man named John Foster Dulles. And just as like a forewarning, in this lesson we're going to hit on a lot of different names and not go into that much detail about them. You'll learn more about these people going forward. It's not the names that are important, but rather the policies and the decisions that they're making. Okay? So, at the time, the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, says that the U.S. must retaliate if its interests are threatened. This is a massive shift in what the U.S. was willing to do before. Essentially, Secretary Dulles is saying the U.S. must be willing to go to war, bring the world to the brink of war if need be. This marks a shift in policy from containment, keeping communism contained to where it is, to brinkmanship, the US actually being willing to take the next step and bring the country to war if they deem it necessary. So the US obviously is going to support France in Vietnam, in French Indochina. After the French are largely forced out of the region, a meeting is made in Geneva. It's called the Geneva Conference. And largely the reason the US is going to support the French is because of the domino theory. Their argument is the French are a much more stable force to prevent Vietnam, prevent French Indochina from falling to communism. So, after the French are forced out of the region, it's decided that French Indochina should be broken up into three different countries that the US will exert its influence in to prevent it from falling to communism. So, Vietnam as a country is split in the middle. Because there is such a strong communist foothold here, the hope is that communism can be contained to the north. So the north will be communist under Ho Chi Minh, and then the Western powers appoint a new figure, Ngo Dinh Diem, to basically rule the South, an anti-communist sanctuary. You'll see very quickly, though, that it's really not this simple. There are a lot of people who support communism in South Vietnam as well, and it's very, very difficult for the US and the Western powers to really protect this region. Just to show you on the side, propaganda is largely going to be used at this time as well. Here you can see an octopus with Joseph Stalin's face on it, spreading its tentacles all over the world. This is largely going to be used to get publics in the US and in the Western European nations to support involvement in Vietnam. Here is a photograph of the Geneva Conference where all of this is going to be decided. And this is what Vietnam is going to look like after its division. It probably looks very familiar to you, probably looks very similar to what you saw in Korea. Don't forget the players who were also in this region. So don't forget, because North Vietnam is so close to China, another massive communist state, they're really going to have the financial and military support of the Chinese. The South, of course, is going to be supported by the United States. Very similar to what you saw in Korea, with China supporting North Korea, the US supporting South Korea. It's a very similar situation here. So Ngo Dinh Diem does not really do what the Western powers are hoping. Elections are scheduled to take place in 1956, and he basically refuses to hold them that year. He knows that he doesn't have popular support. He is a Catholic, he's very westernized, and he's not very well respected by the people of Vietnam. So because he knows he's going to lose, he cancels the elections, and it basically ignites a civil war in Vietnam, and this is really going to be one of the catalysts that leads to U.S. involvement. The U.S. largely gets caught in the middle because they're the ones who put Diem in power, and they're really kind of left to have to fix this. So because Diem is so disliked, and it seems as though he's going against popular beliefs in Vietnam, popular religions. He's persecuting Buddhists. He's going after them in their religious sites. Monks begin doing what's called self-immolation, which basically is a very, very extreme form of very visual protest, where an individual pours gasoline over their head and their clothing and lights themselves on fire in front of spectators, an ultimate sign of disagreeing with the government that's ruling over you. Here you can see one of those monks. This is the gasoline that he poured on himself, and the spectators in the region watching this happen. These images are important because they're really going to fuel the anger and the energy going into the actual Vietnam War. So Diem is obviously in charge of South Vietnam, but he largely becomes a dictator. Don't forget, he was appointed by the Western world, so many people are going to be very unhappy with the West, even in the South. Communist guerrillas begin to rise up to oppose him. So now don't forget, this is mostly in South Vietnam. The Viet Minh, at the time, is mostly in North Vietnam. So in 1963, Vietnamese generals come together and assassinate Diem. There are photographs of his corpse, photographs of the crime scene where he was killed. You can see them online. They're not included in this presentation, though. So the Viet Cong basically plot to take over the South, and around that time, they begin to merge with the Viet Minh. So basically, all of the nationalists, all of the communists in all of Vietnam, including the North and the South, come together to become the Viet Cong. And you can see that symbolized by their flag over here with the two different sides united by the star of communism. So again, I know this is strange, but we're going to be transitioning forward very quickly. Obviously, we spoke about JFK and a lot of his engagements during the Cold War era. In November of 1963, he's unfortunately going to be assassinated at the hands of Lee Harvey Oswald. Again, you'll learn a lot about this in US 2. His vice president at the time is LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He'll become the next president of the United States. So LBJ is going to be responsible for a period known as U.S. escalation. In the 1950s, merely U.S. involvement involved advisors being sent to South Vietnam to oversee Diem, oversee capitalism, oversee anti-communist movements, and basically just defend the region. But over time, those advisors become more and more advisors start to travel there, and eventually it becomes troops, boots on the ground, and then the U.S. is all hands in. So LBJ, kind of going off of the domino theory, says the U.S. has to escalate its involvement in the region. He also tells Congress that the North Vietnamese directly attacked the United States in the Gulf of Tonkin, and basically that would be an act of war, and the U.S. should be able to respond accordingly. So he asks them to utilize U.S. force, which they largely do. Just to show you this on a map, this is the Gulf of Tonkin. So you can see that this is where the U.S. ships were positioned on the coast of North Vietnam. LBJ argues that the North Vietnamese attacked the U.S., and that should give him what he needs to go to war. The thing is, not only does the U.S. get involved in this region, but it's dramatic in how it happens. Congress authorized the Tonkin Gulf Resolutions, which is essentially a blank check. We spoke about these earlier in the year in the context of World War I, when Germany gave a blank check to Austria-Hungary, basically allowing them to do whatever they want. It's going to be a similar scenario here, where basically Congress is allowing the president to take full control and really handle the issue unquestioned. Now we have the War Powers Act, we have all sorts of legislation that really limits the power of the president, and it goes back to this. So basically, the resolutions say the U.S. should take necessary measure to repel attacks and prevent aggression. You're probably thinking, wow, that's really ambiguous. It is. And that's part of the problem. There's really no plan for getting involved and getting out. It's so vague. So basically, it's like getting involved in an endless war. So there on the left, you can see a cartoon depicting American escalation with LBJ on an escalator rising up. Between 1964 and 1966, U.S. military presence dramatically increased in Vietnam. People thought that it was going to be an easy war going in. Think of the historical context of this. World War I, World War II. Going back even farther, the Spanish-American War, the Boxer Rebellion, so many instances where the U.S. was able to kind of come in and be heroic and powerful and save the day and not really be met with too much opposition. They're going to find, though, that this is very different. They're also expecting the U.S. public to throw their unconditional support behind them like they did during the first two world wars, but that's not really going to happen. So the Viet Cong use really different tactics than what U.S. generals are used to. Vietnam is mostly a jungle terrain, which troops for the most part are not familiar with fighting in, and the Viet Cong blend in with the civilian population. You really don't know who's friend and who's foe. You might go into a village in South Vietnam and the people might look incredibly friendly, and it's actually an ambush. And they pull out knives and start stabbing your fellow soldiers. They use children as soldiers, so you might be helping a child on the side of the road, and that child might actually be a member of the Viet Cong. It was a very tumultuous and very stressful situation. Several of these troops came home with PTSD because of the unique climate of the fighting that took place there. The U.S. is also going to use chemical weapons that had never been used previously, as well. So because of the jungle terrain, they're going to use these weapons mostly to clear the cover being used by the Viet Cong. These gases are incredibly poisonous, so if you breathe them in, it could cause lifelong complications, which it did for many of the soldiers. The two most frequently cited chemical weapons during the Vietnam War were napalm and Agent Orange. Napalm is a jellified gas which basically explodes and sticks to surfaces, and that obviously gel continues to explode when it's ignited. You can see in that image over there on the right, that is what napalm looks like when it blows up. Agent Orange is a chemical usually sprayed from planes that destroys foliage, including trees and bushes and plants, so again, eliminating the jungle cover where the Viet Cong would be hiding. Interestingly, my aunt's father was a soldier during Vietnam. He was exposed to Agent Orange, and it basically gave him lifelong complications where he couldn't breathe very well and ultimately died because of the complications caused by Agent Orange. This is what Agent Orange looks like while it's being used. So you can see that the chemical gas has like an orange hue to it. It would largely be sprayed on the jungles and then it would kill everything inside. The habitats in these regions are still in terrible conditions to this day. This is a very famous image from the Vietnam War. Images like this are going to make their way home to the American public, and you can see it really portrays the US troops in a largely negative light. This image is called the Napalm Girl, and of course you can see the one child front and center whose clothes have literally been incinerated by napalm gas. So when people are seeing these things, it's a very different narrative than what they saw during World War I and World War II, really leading them to question if the United States are the heroes of this story. So the most significant transportation route during the Vietnam War was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran all throughout Vietnam from the north to the south. These were jungle supply paths which basically allowed the Chinese and subtly the Soviet Union to supply things to the Viet Cong and then move them through the country. The biggest problem, though, is it actually passed through nearby countries like Laos and Cambodia, so it ties the hands of the United States and really limits their ability to bomb them, because the US isn't at war with Laos or Cambodia. They can only obviously bomb Vietnam, so it's very, very difficult for them to stop this supply chain from being used. Just to show you on a map, this is what it looks like. You can see how there are several branches of the trail that break off into Laos and Cambodia. So, at the time, the Secretary of Defense is a man named Robert McNamara. He is going to oversee a campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder, which is basically a series of carpet bombings where the U.S. is going to just drop unprecedented amounts of weaponry on Vietnam, destroying the environment and just causing absolute carnage. They try to prevent the North Vietnamese supplies from getting to the Viet Cong, but as you just saw on that map, it's very, very challenging for them to actually do this. This is what a plane during Operation Rolling Thunder would look like. You can see the steady stream of bombs being dropped, just to showcase how deadly and how explosive and how dangerous this operation truly was. So one of the most important aspects to understand about the war in Vietnam is the public perspective on it. Don't forget, during World War I and World War II, how were most people receiving their information about the war? It was largely through radio broadcasts or through newspaper, secondhand sources. You were hearing about the war from your government. But now things are changed because of access to a brand new device that wasn't around before, the television. So at the time, the leading general in Vietnam for the US was General William Westmoreland. And he kept telling the public over and over and over again that the North Vietnamese were on the brink of defeat. So people would be hearing that from their government, and then the same night turn on their television and see a very, very different story being depicted. This was a television war, a living room war, where there was footage of what was happening overseas in Vietnam, and it didn't match up with what the government was telling people. They were seeing young men on gurneys, on the ground, bleeding in hospitals in Vietnam, and it did not look positive at all, which of course is going to lead to a credibility gap opening between the government and the actual public. The credibility gap between the public and the government today is also not very strong, but it really goes all the way back to the Vietnam War. People don't trust their government anymore. They feel like they're being lied to. They feel like the government is being dishonest with them. And it starts to inspire several anti-war movements that the government never really had to deal with to the same extent during the world wars. You can see some of those protesters over there to the right, make love, not war. This is happening simultaneously with the hippie movement, with the counterculture, with young adults not wanting to be involved in foreign conflicts. So in US too, you'll really delve into like what the domestic psyche is like of people at home. At the time, two different groups really emerged, not only in government but in the public as well. Doves, people who wanted peace, the protesters, and hawks, war hawks, people who supported being in Vietnam and supported the war. It largely becomes a story of like being American or not being American, being a patriot or not being a patriot. The older generation felt like the youth, the teenagers, the 20-something-year-olds, the newer generation were sacrificing patriotism, were being disloyal, and it really creates a massive rift in American society. Young men begin burning draft cards, they refuse to serve, they have sit-ins on college campuses, all sorts of protests that were unprecedented at the time. One of the most famous instances was during a march on the Pentagon, where you see in this photograph one of the protesters putting flowers in the barrels of US soldiers' guns. It was called Flower Power at the time, basically just really symbolizing how unhappy or unsupportive the general public, especially the youth, were with the Vietnam War. So this credibility gap is never going to be more intense than following the 1968 Tet Offensive. So this is taking place after the Vietnamese New Year. Basically, the Viet Cong launches a surprise attack against the United States, hitting the majority of U.S. air bases and South Vietnamese cities. So it's a massive failure for the Viet Cong, but this is what's really important about the Tet Offensive. It shocks the public. General Westmoreland has been telling the public the Vietnamese are on the brink of collapse, we're going to win this war, they really have no hope. And then you see something like this, and the question becomes, how could an enemy on the verge of defeat launch a surprise attack on almost all of our air bases, on almost all of the cities we're trying to defend? And the credibility gap becomes even greater, even more intense. People believe their government even less, and the popularity of LBJ continues to decline during this time. Of course, images like this will become popular as well, circulating in magazines and newspapers back at home. This is during the Tet Offensive. You can see a U.S. soldier executing a Vietnamese citizen, probably a member of the Viet Cong, on the streets. But again, really painting them in this villainous role, very different than what you saw in World War II. Johnson's presidency largely becomes defined by the conflict in Vietnam. In 1968, following the Tet Offensive, his approval rating falls from 48% to 36%. It's really interesting because LBJ was very similar to Franklin Roosevelt in his pushes to really create social legislation. He creates Medicare and Medicaid, and a lot of the social systems that we still use today, and he really wanted that to be the defining legacy of his time in office, but it becomes all about Vietnam. During Franklin Roosevelt's time in office, his domestic slogan, his campaign, was the New Deal. For LBJ, it was the Great Society. In this image, you can see his Great Society is being depicted as only Vietnam. Kids whose houses are being burnt, whose parents are being killed, and there you can see LBJ in flames. Understand how dramatic this is. Johnson does not seek re-election. Historically, incumbents, people who are in office, usually do win re-election, but he's become so disenchanted, so disillusioned, that he doesn't run again. And this provides a path for Richard Nixon to become the next president of the United States. So Richard Nixon was actually the vice president of Eisenhower, dramatically loses to JFK in 1960, and then after Johnson doesn't run for re-election, Nixon becomes the next president. So one of the most important documents to come out of the Vietnam War and the Cold War era is what's been called the Pentagon Papers. So the Department of Defense launched a study into Vietnam, and basically what they found was that the Johnson administration was being not only dishonest, but just largely lying to the US public about what was happening overseas. They weren't just lying to the public, but they were also lying to Congress, according to many of these files. So the credibility gap just becomes intense. The support for the war really wanes down to very, very few people by the end, and Nixon is really going to implement a policy of withdrawal. So after being elected in 1968, which is an incredibly important year in U.S. history just because of how many things are going on, Nixon begins a policy called very difficult to say, Vietnamization. So basically, the idea is that you're transferring control of the situation in Vietnam from the United States to the Vietnamese. Nixon calls it peace with honor. But to most people looking at this, it's really the United States kind of declaring defeat, that they're really not able to actually do what they went there to do in the first place, which was prevent the spread of communism. So as the U.S. begins transitioning power and control into the hands of Vietnamese troops, you'll see that it doesn't really work out so well. After the United States leaves, Vietnam falls to communism only a few months later. So the question becomes, was this war and all of these deaths really worth it at all? So during the Nixon administration, again, you'll learn about this in U.S. too, he's forced to resign the presidency largely because of the Watergate scandal. So his vice president at the time, Gerald Ford, becomes the next president. He's really going to be the last president who's going to be overseeing this withdrawal from Vietnam. So by 1974, fighting is going to restart between the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese. The U.S. say they are not getting involved in the region anymore. They still do have an embassy in the region, but the public just doesn't have the support, and they have no willingness basically to go back. Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital, is overthrown, and the U.S. embassy falls as all U.S. officials, as well as several South Vietnamese allies, flee. You can see that taking place in this image here. This is a CIA member helping several of the fleeing peoples into a chopper to leave the country. By 1975, all of Vietnam had fallen to communism, and the country remains communist even today. Here is a victory parade of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, many of them holding posters with Ho Chi Minh's face on them, again celebrating U.S. exit and their victory during the Vietnam War. So just in terms of legacy, the question becomes, was this war really worth it? It cost $150 billion, over 58,000 U.S. soldiers lost their lives, 3 million Vietnamese lost their lives between civilians and military officers, and for many historians, for many politicians, for many citizens, the Vietnam War is considered to be really the first U.S. military defeat in its history. The U.S. never declared defeat, and they never signed a surrender, but they leave the region, they give up on their original goal, which is largely humiliating for the U.S. in a lot of different ways. It's also very challenging, too, for the young men who fought in the Vietnam War. They were greeted very differently than their fathers and their grandfathers in World War II. And of course, in World War I, they come home to disrespect. The public doesn't really support the war by the end, and many of them are looking at these soldiers as like almost villainous. So it's very difficult for them to find jobs. Many Vietnam veterans today are still homeless, are still suffering from PTSD, and the legacy of Vietnam continues to haunt them very much so. So in our next lesson, we'll really wrap up the Cold War, and we'll begin talking about the thawing of tensions.